Military personnel, FBI agents, and local law enforcement had combed through every inch of the training ground. Helicopters had circled overhead for weeks, their rotors cutting through the silence of the forest. Search dogs had followed scent trails that led nowhere. The official report, filed away in dusty cabinets, concluded that the soldiers had likely encountered some form of accident in the treacherous terrain, their bodies lost to the wilderness, perhaps fallen into one of the many hidden caves that dotted the limestone bedrock beneath the Kentucky soil. But Sarah had always suspected there was more to the story. She had been a rookie officer back then, fresh out of the academy, assigned to help with the perimeter searches. She remembered the haunted expressions on the faces of the commanding officers, the way conversations stopped abruptly when civilians approached, the classified briefings that even local law enforcement wasn't privy to. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning, just as Sarah was reviewing the cold case files she had requested from the archives. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Webb, a local construction foreman whose crew had been contracted to clear some land for a new training facility. "Detective Mitchell, you need to get out here right away," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. "We found something that's been buried for a very long time." The drive to the construction site took Sarah through winding country roads lined with towering oak and maple trees, their leaves painted in brilliant shades of orange and red. The October sun filtered through the canopy, casting dancing shadows on the asphalt. As she pulled up to the site, she could see a cluster of workers standing around what appeared to be a large excavation. Their faces were pale, their usual jovial construction site banter replaced by hushed, nervous whispers. Marcus met her at the edge of the dig site, his hard hat in his hands, dirt streaking his weathered face. He was a man in his 50s, built like a linebacker, with the kind of steady demeanor that came from decades of handling heavy machinery and managing crews. But today his hands trembled slightly as he pointed toward the excavation. "We were digging the foundation for the new building when the bulldozer hit something solid," he explained, leading Sarah toward the pit. "At first we thought it was just a large boulder, maybe some old limestone, but then we cleared away more dirt and realized it was concrete. Man-made concrete." Sarah peered into the excavation and felt her breath catch in her throat. Partially exposed in the red Kentucky clay was the unmistakable outline of a concrete structure. It was massive, far larger than anything that should have been buried in this remote section of the military reservation. The concrete was weathered and stained, clearly decades old, but it appeared to be structurally sound. "Have you contacted the base commander?" Sarah asked, her detective instincts immediately kicking in. Marcus nodded grimly. "Called them as soon as we realized what we'd found. They're sending someone out, but they said it might take a few hours. Told us to stop all work immediately and secure the site." Sarah pulled out her phone and called her supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez. Rodriguez had been with the state police for over 20 years and had worked on the original missing soldiers case. If anyone would understand the significance of this discovery, it would be him. "Lieutenant, we may have found something related to the missing soldiers from '88, Sarah said when Rodriguez answered. "I'm going to need a full forensics team out here, and we're going to need to coordinate with military personnel." As they waited for backup to arrive, Sarah walked the perimeter of the excavation, her trained eye taking in every detail. The concrete structure appeared to be some kind of underground facility, possibly a bunker or storage area. But what struck her as odd was its location. According to the original investigation files, this area had been thoroughly searched. How had such a large structure gone undetected for 35 years? The answer came when she noticed something that made her stomach tighten with unease. Along one edge of the exposed concrete, she could see what appeared to be scratch marks, deep gouges in the surface that looked disturbingly like claw marks. But these weren't made by any animal she could identify. They were too large, too deliberate, and they seemed to emanate from inside the structure, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. By late afternoon, the site had been transformed into a hub of activity. Military vehicles lined the access road, their olive-drab paint stark against the autumn landscape. FBI agents in dark suits moved efficiently around the perimeter, establishing a secure zone and beginning their own preliminary investigation. The forensics team from the state police had arrived with ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment to better understand the scope of the underground structure. Colonel Richard Hawthorne, the current base commander at Fort Campbell, arrived just as the sun was beginning to set behind the tree line. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in the military. But Sarah noticed something in his eyes when he looked at the excavation, a flicker of recognition that suggested he knew more about this discovery than he was letting on. "Detective Mitchell," Colonel Hawthorne said, extending his hand in greeting. "I understand you've been reviewing the case of our missing soldiers." "That's correct, Colonel. And I have to ask, did you know about this structure?" Hawthorne's expression remained carefully neutral. "This area has been used for training exercises for decades. There are many old structures scattered throughout the reservation, some dating back to World War II. Without more information, it's impossible to say what this might be." But Sarah wasn't buying it. She had seen that look before, in witnesses who were holding back crucial information. "Colonel, with all due respect, a structure this size doesn't just get forgotten. Someone knew it was here." The ground-penetrating radar revealed the true scope of what lay beneath the Kentucky soil. The underground facility was enormous, stretching nearly 200 feet in length and at least 50 feet in width. It appeared to have multiple levels, with what looked like corridors and chambers extending deep into the earth. The structure was oriented in a way that suggested it had been designed for maximum concealment, built into a natural depression in the landscape and covered with enough soil and vegetation to hide it from aerial surveillance. Dr. Emily Chen, the forensic archaeologist who had been called in to oversee the excavation, stood at the edge of the pit with a look of professional fascination mixed with growing concern. She was a petite woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails from decades of careful excavation work. "This is definitely military construction," she told Sarah as they watched the crews carefully expose more of the concrete structure. "The construction techniques, the materials, the way it's been reinforced, all point to a classified military installation. But here's what's strange. The concrete shows signs of having been sealed from the outside relatively recently, maybe 30 to 40 years ago, around the time our soldiers disappeared," Sarah observed. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "The timeline certainly fits. And there's something else you should know. We've detected what appears to be an entrance on the north side of the structure. It's been sealed with concrete, but we can see where the original access point was located. As darkness fell over the excavation site, portable floodlights illuminated the work area, casting harsh shadows across the exposed concrete. The teams worked in shifts, carefully removing soil and debris while documenting every detail of their progress. Sarah found herself unable to leave, drawn by an instinct that told her they were on the verge of uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden for decades. It was just after midnight when they found the first piece of evidence that linked the bunker directly to the missing soldiers. A metal detector sweep of the surrounding area had turned up what appeared to be military dog tags, buried about 20 feet from the main structure. The tags were corroded and barely readable, but Dr. Chen was able to make out enough of the stamped information to confirm what Sarah had suspected all along. "Private First Class David Morrison, service number 7895432 Town," Dr. Chen read from the tags, her voice barely above a whisper. According to the records, he was one of the 12 soldiers who disappeared during the training exercise. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool October night. "We need to get those families notified immediately, and we need to open this bunker." But Colonel Hawthorne, who had remained on site throughout the night, immediately objected. "Detective, this is now officially a military matter. Any further investigation will need to be conducted through proper military channels. With all due respect, Colonel, we have evidence of a potential crime scene. This falls under civilian jurisdiction until proven otherwise." The standoff between military and civilian authority continued through the early morning hours, with phone calls being made to officials in Washington and Frankfurt. Finally, a compromise was reached. The investigation would be a joint operation, with both military and civilian personnel working together under the oversight of a federal task force. As dawn broke over the excavation site, Sarah found herself thinking about the families of the missing soldiers. For 35 years they had lived with uncertainty, not knowing whether their loved ones were dead or alive, not knowing if they had died heroically in service to their country, or had simply vanished into the Kentucky wilderness. Now finally, they might have answers. The decision was made to carefully breach the sealed entrance to the bunker. A specialized team of military engineers was brought in to assess the structural integrity of the facility and determine the safest way to gain access. The concrete seal at the entrance appeared to be several feet thick, suggesting that whoever had closed off the bunker had intended for it to remain sealed permanently. Dr. Chen supervised the careful removal of the concrete seal, using precision tools to avoid damaging whatever might be waiting inside. As the first hole was drilled through the barrier, a rush of stale, musty air escaped from the bunker, carrying with it an odor that made several of the investigators step back in disgust. "That's definitely the smell of decomposition," Dr. Chen said grimly, adjusting her respirator mask. "Old decomposition, but still present after all these years." The full breach of the entrance took most of the morning. When the concrete barrier was finally removed, it revealed a heavy steel door, military issue, that stood slightly ajar. Beyond the door was nothing but darkness, an impenetrable black void that seemed to swallow the beams of their powerful flashlights. Sarah was among the first to enter the bunker, following behind a team of military investigators equipped with full hazmat gear and air quality monitoring equipment. The entrance led to a concrete corridor that extended into the earth at a slight downward angle. The walls were lined with what appeared to be ventilation ducts and electrical conduits, all long since defunct. The air inside the bunker was thick and oppressive, filled with the musty scent of decades of stagnant air and something else, something organic and unpleasant that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as they made their way deeper into the facility. The first chamber they encountered was clearly some kind of control room. Banks of old computer equipment lined the walls, their screens dark and their keyboards covered with dust. Most of the technology appeared to be from the 1980s, primitive by modern standards but state-of-the-art for its time. In the center of the room was a large map table, and scattered across its surface were detailed topographical maps of the Fort Campbell area, marked with various symbols and notations in red ink. "This was definitely a command and control facility," Colonel Hawthorne observed, examining the equipment with professional interest. "But I've never seen any records of such an installation in this area." Dr. Chen was photographing everything, documenting the scene with meticulous care. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a logbook that lay open on one of the control consoles. "The last entry is dated October 15th, 1988, the same day the soldiers disappeared." Sarah leaned over to read the entry, written in neat military handwriting. "Exercise blackout proceeding as planned. All subjects responding normally to Phase 1 protocols. Initiating Phase 2 at 2100 hours. Dr. Kessler expressing concerns about safety parameters, but General Morrison overruling objections." The mention of General Morrison caught Sarah's attention immediately. She knew that name from the original case files. Brigadier General Thomas Morrison had been the commanding officer in charge of the training exercise when the soldiers disappeared. He had retired from the military shortly after the incident and had died of a heart attack nearly 10 years ago. As they continued deeper into the bunker, they discovered a series of smaller rooms that appeared to have been living quarters. Each room contained a simple cot, a small desk, and a locker. But what was disturbing was that the rooms showed signs of having been occupied recently, relatively speaking. The beds were unmade, personal items were scattered about, and in several cases they found military uniforms hanging in the lockers. Dr. Chen examined one of the uniforms, checking the name tape sewn above the breast pocket. "Sergeant Michael Torres," she read aloud. "Another one of our missing soldiers." The deeper they went into the bunker, the more disturbing their discoveries became. They found a medical facility equipped with examination tables, surgical instruments, and what appeared to be monitoring equipment. The walls were lined with filing cabinets filled with medical records and research data, all related to something called Project Mindbridge. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a military psychiatrist who had been called in to consult on the investigation, spent hours reviewing the files they had discovered. When she finally emerged from the medical facility, her face was pale and her hands were shaking slightly. "Detective Mitchell, Colonel Hawthorne, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Project Mindbridge was an experimental program designed to enhance soldier performance through a combination of psychological conditioning and pharmaceutical intervention. According to these files, the 12 missing soldiers were unwilling test subjects. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Sarah felt her stomach lurch as the implications became clear. "Are you saying that our missing soldiers were used as guinea pigs in some kind of illegal medical experiment?" Dr. Hoffman nodded grimly. "The files indicate that the soldiers were told they were participating in a routine training exercise, but they were actually being subjected to experimental drugs and psychological manipulation techniques. The goal was to create soldiers who could operate for extended periods without sleep, who could maintain peak performance under extreme stress, and who could follow orders without question or hesitation. Colonel Hawthorne looked as though he had been physically struck. This is impossible. The military doesn't conduct unauthorized experiments on its own personnel. There are strict protocols, oversight committees, ethical review boards. Not according to these files, Dr. Hoffman replied, holding up a thick folder marked with security classifications. Project Mindbridge was a black budget operation, funded through classified channels and conducted with minimal oversight. The experiment was supposed to last only 72 hours, but something went wrong. As they continued their exploration of the bunker, they found evidence of what had gone wrong. In the deepest section of the facility, they discovered what could only be described as holding cells. Heavy steel doors with small observation windows opened onto concrete chambers, barely large enough for a person to lie down. The walls of these cells bore the same scratch marks they had seen on the exterior of the bunker, deep gouges in the concrete that spoke of desperate attempts to escape. But it was in the final chamber that they made the most disturbing discovery of all. The room was larger than the others, with a high ceiling and what appeared to be observation windows along one wall. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and scattered around it were the remains of military equipment, personal effects, and human bones. Dr. Chen worked carefully to examine the remains, her archaeological training serving her well in the grim task of documenting what appeared to be a mass grave. "I count skeletal remains from at least 12 individuals," she reported, her voice clinical but strained. "All appear to be adult males, consistent with the age range of our missing soldiers. But there was something else, something that defied easy explanation. Mixed in with the human remains were bones that didn't appear to be human at all. They were larger, with unusual proportions and structures that Dr. Chen couldn't immediately identify. "I'm going to need to get these to a forensic anthropologist for proper analysis," she said, carefully bagging specimens for transport to the laboratory. "But I can tell you right now, some of these bones don't match any known human anatomy." The investigation of the bunker continued for several more days, with each new discovery adding another piece to a puzzle that grew more disturbing with each revelation. They found detailed records of the experimental procedures that had been conducted on the soldiers, including daily observations of their physical and mental deterioration as the drugs and psychological conditioning took their toll. The files painted a picture of a program that had spiraled completely out of control. The soldiers had been given increasingly powerful combinations of stimulants, hallucinogens, and experimental compounds designed to alter their brain chemistry. The psychological conditioning had involved prolonged periods of sensory deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and techniques that could only be described as torture. Dr. Hoffman found evidence that several of the soldiers had suffered complete psychological breaks within the first 48 hours of the experiment. Others had developed severe physical symptoms, including seizures, organ failure, and what the medical records described as unprecedented cellular mutations. "It's like they were trying to turn these men into something other than human," Dr. Hoffman told Sarah as they reviewed the files together. "The drugs they were using, the psychological techniques, the genetic material they were injecting, none of it was designed to enhance normal human capabilities. It was designed to create something entirely new." The most chilling discovery came when they found Dr. Marcus Kessler's personal research notes. Dr. Kessler had been the lead scientist on Project Mindbridge, and his notes revealed a man who had grown increasingly horrified by what he was being asked to do. "Day 12, read one entry. "The subjects are showing signs of severe physical transformation. The genetic modifications are progressing faster than anticipated. General Morrison insists we continue, but I believe we have created something that cannot be controlled. The subjects are displaying signs of enhanced strength, altered sensory perception, and what can only be described as predatory behavior. I fear we have crossed a line that should never have been crossed." The final entry in Dr. Kessler's notes was dated October 15, 1988, the same day the soldiers had disappeared. "The subjects have broken containment. Repeat, the subjects have broken containment. They are no longer responding to verbal commands or chemical restraints. I am initiating Emergency Protocol Omega. May God forgive us all for what we have done." Emergency Protocol Omega, according to the files they found, involved the complete termination of the project and the elimination of all evidence. The bunker was to be sealed, all records destroyed, and all personnel involved were to be reassigned to other duties with strict non-disclosure agreements. But something had gone wrong with the protocol as well. Instead of a clean shutdown, there had been a violent confrontation in the depths of the bunker. The evidence suggested that the transformed soldiers had fought back against their captors, leading to a battle that had left everyone dead. Sarah stood in the main chamber of the bunker, surrounded by the evidence of one of the most disturbing cover-ups in military history. The families of the missing soldiers deserved to know the truth, but the truth was so horrific that she wondered if anyone would believe it. Colonel Hawthorne had been largely silent since the discovery of the Project Mindbridge files. As a career military officer, he was struggling to reconcile what they had found with his beliefs about military honor and integrity. "Detective Mitchell," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need you to understand that what happened here does not represent the values or practices of the United States military. This was the work of individuals who violated every principle we hold sacred." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still questions that hadn't been answered. "Colonel, I need to ask you directly. Did you know about any of this before we found the bunker?" Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence scattered around the chamber. "No," he said finally, "but I knew there were rumors, stories that circulated in certain circles about black projects and unauthorized experiments. I chose not to pursue those rumors because I believed they were just conspiracy theories spread by people with anti-military agendas." As the investigation began to wind down, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they had discovered. How many other Project Mindbridges were there? How many other soldiers had been used as unwitting test subjects in the name of national security? The FBI had taken over most of the investigation at this point, classifying much of what they had found and restricting access to the information. The families of the missing soldiers were finally given closure, but they were also sworn to secrecy about the true circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Sarah was allowed to write a limited report for the state police files, but most of the details were classified at levels far above her security clearance. The official story released to the public was that the missing soldiers had been found deceased in an underground facility that had collapsed during a training accident 35 years ago. But late at night, when Sarah was alone in her office reviewing the case files one last time, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange bones that Dr. Chen had found mixed in with the human remains. The forensic anthropologist's report had been inconclusive, noting only that the bones displayed unusual characteristics not consistent with known human anatomy. There was also the matter of Dr. Kessler's fate. According to military records, he had died in a car accident 2 weeks after the incident at Fort Campbell. But Sarah had found evidence in the bunker, suggesting that Dr. Kessler had been working on additional research, possibly attempting to reverse the effects of the genetic modifications he had inflicted on the soldiers. The most disturbing piece of evidence was a final video log that they had found in Dr. Kessler's personal effects. The recording was badly degraded, but Sarah could make out enough to understand that Dr. Kessler believed some of the test subjects might have survived the confrontation in the bunker. "If my calculations are correct," Dr. Kessler's voice crackled through the static, "the genetic modifications may have enhanced their survival capabilities beyond anything we anticipated. They may have found a way to escape the facility before the final containment protocols were implemented. If that's the case, then they could still be out there, somewhere in the wilderness, possibly still alive but no longer entirely human." Sarah had tried to pursue this lead, but she had been quietly reassigned to other cases and told that the Fort Campbell incident was now a federal matter beyond her jurisdiction. The bunker had been filled in with concrete and the area declared off limits to civilian personnel, but she couldn't let it go entirely. In her spare time, she continued to research reports of unusual animal attacks in the Kentucky wilderness, missing hikers and strange sightings reported by hunters and campers. There had been a handful of incidents over the years, scattered reports of encounters with something that witnesses described as human-like but wrong somehow. Too tall, too fast, too aggressive. Most of these reports had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but Sarah saw a pattern that others had missed. The incidents were clustered around the Fort Campbell area, and they occurred roughly every 5 to 7 years, as if whatever was out there emerged periodically from deep in the wilderness to hunt. The latest incident had occurred just 6 months before the discovery of the bunker. A group of college students on a camping trip had reported being stalked by something they described as a man-like creature with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. One of the students had been badly injured, with claw marks that doctors couldn't explain. The case had been classified as a bear attack, but the wounds were unlike anything a bear would inflict. Sarah had interviewed the injured student, a young man named Kyle Henderson who was studying biology at the University of Kentucky. Kyle had been reluctant to talk about his experience, but Sarah's gentle persistence had eventually convinced him to share the details of what had happened. It wasn't a bear, Kyle had insisted, his voice shaking as he recalled the encounter. Bears don't stalk humans the way this thing did. Bears don't watch you from the shadows for hours before they attack. And bears definitely don't retreat when you make eye contact with them. This thing, whatever it was intelligent. It was studying us, learning our patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. Kyle's description of the creature matched reports from other incidents over the years. Witnesses consistently described something that moved with unnatural speed and agility, something that seemed to understand human behavior, but was clearly not human itself. As Sarah sat in her office, reading through Kyle's statement for the 100th time, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Kessler's final fears had been justified. The soldiers who had been subjected to the genetic modifications in Project Mindbridge might indeed have survived, transformed into something that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. The official investigation was closed, the bunker was sealed, and the families of the missing soldiers had finally received the closure they had sought for 35 years. But Sarah knew that the real story was far from over. Somewhere in the dense forests of Kentucky, the true legacy of Project Mindbridge might still be alive, still hunting, still waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too far from the safety of civilization. The autumn wind continued to blow across the hills of Fort Campbell, carrying with it the secrets of the past and the whispered promise of horrors yet to be revealed. The bunker was gone, buried beneath tons of concrete and earth, but the darkness it had contained had found other places to hide, other shadows in which to wait for the next chapter of its terrible story to unfold. As Sarah finally closed the case file and locked it away in her desk drawer, she made a mental note to keep monitoring reports of unusual incidents in the Fort Campbell area. She had a feeling that the story of the missing soldiers was far from over, and that someday, someone would need to be ready to face whatever had emerged from the depths of that underground laboratory 35 years ago. The truth, as Sarah had learned, was often far more terrifying than any cover-up could ever be, and sometimes, the monsters we create in the name of progress are the ones that come back to haunt us when we least expect it.